So this video was a request by a viewer. They were wondering how I wired up my amp to the factory stereo. So here we go. And if you didn't watch my last video, I kind of walked you through the steps I took to make this fiberglass subwoofer enclosure for an 8-inch SCAR VD8. And I'll show you what I did to wire it up to this SCAR RP351D, so Class D amplifier. Wired up a big old 4-gauge power cable to the positive side. I did have to trim a little bit of this plastic cover. I did crimp and solder this terminal, use heat shrink, use nice wire loom to cover this, and wired up my fuse to this fuse block. I took this panel off, which covers the shock tower, and to get to this, there's these series of clips all along here that just pop right off. This whole panel can flip up out of the way, and then there's two 10mm bolts, one here and one kind of back under here, and this whole kind of vanity panel comes off. And I riveted my fuse block from the bottom side so it's nice and flush. And then I secured my power cable with the zip tie right here. I just drilled 2 holes, zip tied it here, so for some reason this comes loose, this cable right here isn't dangling and gonna ground out on anything. So this is the biggest hazard from the battery to the beginning of the fuse. This is unprotected, so that needs to be secured in some way so it doesn't ground out. If it disconnects from the battery, then who cares? There's no power from here, so this isn't really a problem if this comes loose. Moving on, once it goes through the fuse, I crimped and soldered, heat shrinked again. I tried to use red heat shrink for any wire that had power, black heat shrink for the grounds. I added this wire loom on top of the 4-gauge wire and ran it down to a factory grommet that goes into the cab of the truck. To give you an idea of where that grommet is, here's the pedals. And there's the grommet right there. You can see where I ended the wire loom and the power cables coming down and then starting to route through the truck plastics all the way to the back. So this plastic piece is the first one to come out. This just has a series of clips that are straight down, so you can pop this little kick panel out. This panel pulls straight up, and basically all this blue panel pops out. This big back panel, I didn't remove all the way. I just popped these end clips loose so I can get this side panel out of the way. There's a couple clips on the bottom of the rear speaker cowling that pop off. And then there's 2 clips on top that are super easy to break. You can watch a bunch of other rear speaker upgrade videos. Some people have broken these clips. Once you get this bottom piece kind of out of the way, you can stick a pry bar or something on here, and you have to push these 2 tabs up and then out. Otherwise you're gonna snap them off. When it goes back in, it doesn't have to go through that top hole and down. Those clips can just snap right in. So it's an easy install. It's kind of hard to get out, but it slides up and out. So again, this is the driver rear side. My power cable is running underneath this plastic. Comes out right here and to my amp. So here's the power in. The whole reason I went with a 4-gauge amp kit is because these receptacles take up to a 4-gauge wire. Here's my ground wire, main battery power, ground, and remote 12 volt in to wake this up. So you can either wire this into your vehicle accessory. I didn't do that. I get my remote 12 volt signal from this line output converter. I'll explain that in a sec. Your audio input is an RCA for this amp anyways. This is where your music comes in. So here's, I think, 16 gauge speaker wire. One of these has a line that's always pretty much universal for negative. So I just soldered power to power, ground to ground from my rear speakers on both sides. So I have a speaker input wired in to this line output converter. So I did solder and heat shrink all these. You can see the red again are my positive inputs. Black heat shrink are for my negative inputs. And then you basically have a left speaker and a right speaker gain. So as you turn that up, it's going to output a higher voltage signal to the amplifier. So that's where it gets its audio signal from. This is just a cheapo line output converter, like less than 20 bucks. A lot of big audio guys have tested these, and as soon as you turn up the gain, like barely up from closed all the way, this is going to output distorted music, a distorted signal. I basically got the cheapest one that had the most purchases and the best reviews. I knew it was gonna work, and you can always upgrade this later to a higher end one from like Audio Control, but that's gonna run you probably 120 bucks just for a quality line output converter. So it does have a left and a right RCA output, but for whatever reason, when I had both of these plugged into this, my sub wouldn't play music. When I was troubleshooting, I would unplug one and then it would start to play fine. So I ended up just getting a Y connector, and I'm only playing out this right channel. This one's turned all the way off, nothing's plugged into the left side. I just have a Y connector that plugs into my left and right RCAs that plug into the back of that. So I'm using both channels on the amp, but it's only getting a signal from one rear speaker. So tuning this, especially by ear, can be a little tricky, because if you just crank this up all the way, it can distort, just like if you turn the gain up too high on an amp. The best way to do it would be with an oscilloscope. I did set my gain initially with this with just a simple mathematical equation. So my subwoofer is a dual voice coil in 4 ohms. It's wired in parallel, so the final impedance is 2 ohms. My amp is rated to play 250 watts RMS for a 2 ohm load. So I multiplied 250 times 2, which equals 500. I took the square root of 500, which equals 22.3 volts AC, which is a safe starting voltage to set my gain to. So how you set your gain with that mathematical equation and just a multimeter. You can, before you hook up your sub, this is the power and ground speaker wire to my sub. You can take these out, put your multimeter leads to positive and negative, and set it to volts AC. And then you can play a test tone, like a 50 hertz test tone on YouTube. And you slowly turn up your gain until you hit 22 volts AC. And then you know your amp gain is set to your subwoofer wiring. So something I wish I would have done, I wish I would have left myself a little bit more room on this amp mount. That way I could have a way to secure the wiring here in case this terminal fails and this power wire comes out. It's not just dangling around and gonna ground out. Yes, it is fused under the hood, but I think I'm gonna build something that either mounts to this or these little bolts sticking out. That way I can secure my amp wiring. And then I just used a factory ground for my big amp ground and line output converter ground. For my 12 volt remote input, this line output converter has a constant 12 volt signal, which I ran in with my big power cable right here, this red wire. Once it senses an audio signal from the rear speakers, it'll send a remote 12-volt signal to the amp. So this will turn on my amp once it senses an audio signal. So that's pretty cool. I don't have to find a remote power wire up front. So there are multiple means of tuning your speaker input before it gets to your subwoofer, and here's the first one. So in your factory settings, before you hook up your phone, you go into your settings, sound, and now here's your treble, mid-range, and bass. So changing this bass setting will change the audio signal that's going to your line output converter, which will affect the signal it sends to your amp. So with this all the way up, it's gonna push your door speakers as well. It's gonna send the most bass response to your door speakers. So if you don't want to push those as much, I ended up turning this down just a tad. I ended up turning up my mids and highs because that's what I want these to emphasize. And then I started to tune my LOC and my amp gain after this. And also another thing that can affect it, if you plug in a bass controller, you need to have this turned all the way up, because if this is turned halfway down or towards the minimum, and then you set your gain perfectly and you come over here and max it out, that's going to be playing louder than what you safely tuned your amp to and tuned it to by ear. So this needs to be up. This will affect the signal that's going to your line output converter. Then again, there's a gain on your line output converter, and then there's also a gain and low pass filter on your amp. So it's kind of involved. It takes a little while. After playing with it for just a couple days, I think I got the settings just right, so it matches my front door speakers and it's not gonna damage my subwoofer. So a couple things that helped this install was color coordinated heat shrink and these wire ferrules. So these are labeled. I was using 4-gauge wire for my big power and grounds. These are 4-gauge ferrules. Here's an example of how that works. I cut this one off. I don't know, I messed this one up for some reason, so I cut it off. But here's the power wire. You put the ferrule over the wire so you don't have loose strands. Heat shrink that, and then when you stick it in and secure it in the amp, that Allen bolt squishes this down. So this is a super soft metal, and all of this will conform to the amp receptacle to get the best connection possible, so that Allen bolt's not just squishing the middle wires and these are just hanging free. You actually get all this to contact. So that's it. It sounds more complicated than it really is. So again, you're grabbing your signal from your rear speakers to a line output converter. It can be a cheap one, it could be an expensive one. The better quality signal you send to your amp, the better output it's going to send to your speaker. But your RCAs send your audio signal into your amp. You have a gain, low pass filter, and a subsonic. I just left that all the way off. And then that's going to send the signal out to your sub. And this is just real easy, power and ground.